Now, in today's class, let's start with understanding a simple MVC concept with Spring. Okay, as we already know that Spring is a framework which has a lot of modules. Out of that, MVC is one specific module where you can use the concept of the front controller or the means model view controller design pattern and can send some requests from the client where the server can receive those requests and process them and get back the response back to the client. Okay, so let's start understanding the basic flow of a Spring MVC. Okay, so for that, what I do is like again the same old concept. I go back and create a simple project like a dynamic web project. I'll name it as Spring MVC project. Say next, and select this one to generate web.xml and say finish. So I created a simple dynamic web project. So to this project, to give or to add more functionalities like the Spring, what I do is I go ahead and add all the required jars which will help us in getting the features of Spring. One second, I think it's a little bit slow. Okay, so it has created a project called a Spring MVC project. So to this project, the first step that I'm going to do here is in the lib, I will drop all the required jar files. Okay, so I do have all the required jar files. Control A, Control C, and Control V. So I added all the jar files. And the basic thing that you need to understand here is in this concept, we need some additional jars to work on, like Hibernate validated jar, MySQL connector jar, log4j, commons DBCP, commons logging, AOP aliens. Means these kind of jars, these are all required for some dependencies, additional dependencies that Spring is having, and for additional dependencies that we are going to use in our project. So maybe these things that you will only encounter like when I give my project, just adding Spring 4 jars alone will not help you. You need to add these additional jars. I will let you know like from where exactly you can download these set of jars and all. Okay. So what I can say is you can go to the same old URL like a GitHub. If I say the repositories, and the other thing is like Spring 3 JDBC template MySQL. So this is the link. Maybe if you can just store the link for now. This link, it has a project, but one thing is this might not work directly like when you go ahead to this GitHub and click on this download zip, and if you use it, it might not work straight away. Why? Because this was developed a while ago using JDK version 1.7 or 6, I guess, and they have Spring 3.2 jars actually. So what I want you to do is the first thing, maybe once you download, go to WebINF, go to lib. Okay, so in this lib, once you download the project, you can remove all the 3.2 jars, and instead of 3.2 you can add version 4 jars. And if you see here, I'm not adding all the jars which are like Spring 4 jars, Spring 3.2 jars, or any other jars. I only added specific jars which I need in this current context. So maybe you can also add only specific jars, and apart from this, these are all the additional jars that you need. Okay, so go ahead, download this project or download this lib library folder, and copy all these jars and rename with your stuff. Okay. Now the next thing that you need to understand in this concept is like how you can make use of the MVC concept to send a request and to get the request. Okay. So what I say here is, I hope everyone has noted down that link that I had shared. Yeah, and the other thing is like, okay, yeah, first start with the common stuff. So once you add all the lib, it will get the features of Spring. Now the next thing, web.xml file. I hope everyone understands that the web.xml file is a file which gets the request when a request comes to the application for the means initially every request will come to web.xml for URL pattern validation, right? So again in web.xml, what we need to do, we need to do some configurations. Okay, so I'll do those configurations, but before that, let me proceed, or let me explain in a standard way. Welcome. Welcome file. The configurations that I'm doing here might slightly differ from what we do in struts. I will explain why we are doing that. The first thing, in the welcome file, let me configure different one, like every time we configure a login.jsp here, but in this one, in the welcome file, I'll go ahead and configure something different called as index.jsp. Okay, so once I configure index.jsp, the next thing that I will go ahead and do is URL pattern configuration. Okay, so I hope everyone remembers the concept where I can go ahead and check for all the incoming URLs, and if they are valid URLs, then means if it is a struts. Okay, let me just open the struts application. Web.xml for first struts project. I hope everyone remembers that in the concept of struts, what did we do? We did a URL pattern matching where if a URL comes like star.do, and since struts is following an MVC pattern, every incoming request is handed over to action servlet, where action servlet decides what to do with it based on the configurations done in struts.config.xml. Okay, so this is the basic configurations that we did. The same way in the web.xml, I will do a URL pattern matching initially. So I say the servlet mapping, and I say servlet name and URL pattern. So let's go with the standard one. So the URL pattern that I configured here is just a slash, and the next thing is the servlet name. The servlet name can be anything, but there is a specific reason why we give a meaningful name to servlet name in this context. So the URL pattern I say as slash, which means anything which comes after the web context slash, anything is a valid pattern, or I can say slash, or I can say star, or anything. Okay, so I'm just trying to make sure that every incoming request will be handled. Okay, so slash, then the next one that I say here is my servlet. Okay, some in go ahead and invoke my servlet. That is what I told. Now here in the servlet configuration, see whatever we are configuring here at from line number 14 and all, servlet name, servlet class, these are all some basic standard configurations. So when a URL pattern called slash comes, means anything after that slash comes, I will hand it over to my servlet, and here notice here what will I do? I will invoke a servlet class. When I say a servlet class, It is nothing but a specific controller servlet which Spring has given. Now my question to everyone, is the servlet that we are configuring at line number 16, will we write that servlet, or will the will we call the servlet given by Spring container? What is the answer? Very good. We will call the servlet which is given by Spring container. Okay. So what is the servlet which is given by the Spring container? The servlet given by the Spring container is present in Spring core jar. So if you see Spring core window, 1 second, Spring basics, reference libraries, Spring core jar. So inside Spring core jar, it will be in org Spring framework, then web org Spring framework, Spring hyphen core. Okay, okay, not Spring hyphen core. Spring MVC. 1 second. Let me come to Spring Web MVC for the Spring Web Servlet. So this is the package, and inside this package, if I go ahead and expand, there are multiple classes, out of which there is a class called Dispatcher Servlet. Did you notice here? There is something called as a Dispatcher Servlet, where the Dispatcher Servlet is the class that must be invoked, and Dispatcher Servlet is considered as the controller in the Spring MVC. Okay, now if you notice, or if you go back to the structs, in structs, action servlet is the controller. So what is action servlet doing? Action servlet will accept all the valid URL patterns and will decide from there what to do. The same way in Spring, the dispatcher servlet acts as a controller which will decide what exactly to do with all the valid incoming URL patterns. So I will invoke the dispatcher servlet. I will say org dot, see exact package I will write org dot spring framework dot web dot servlet dot dispatcher servlet. Okay, org dot spring framework dot web dot servlet dot dispatcher servlet is the servlet that I have configured. So what did I do in this web.xml? Very basic scenario. If a valid URL pattern comes, then invoke my servlet, which is nothing but at line number 15. If this matches, then invoke the servlet given by the Spring framework called the dispatcher servlet. Okay, is this configuration clear to everyone? Ravi, Sai, Sandeep, Azim, Siddharth, Vikas. Yeah, Vikas, are you following? Yeah, Sai, that's correct. Line number 21 says any URL pattern after the context root. Okay, anything is valid. Okay, now the next concept or next question to everyone. Dispatcher servlet is mandatory servlet, always should revoke or invoke, right? So yeah, the question to Ravi's answer is like, in Spring we need to call or we must call dispatcher servlet only. Okay, now the answer to your question is yes and no. Why yes is yes, we need to call the dispatcher servlet only. Why no is, if you want some additional features, what you can do, you can always go ahead and write your own class which extends dispatcher servlet. So you get all the features of dispatcher servlet and add some custom features, and here at line number 16 you can say, hey, instead of calling dispatcher servlet, go ahead and call my own servlet which has all the dispatcher servlet features since I'm extending it, and some additional features that I have given. So it is not a mandatory thing that you must only use dispatcher servlet. You can use your custom servlet also which uses dispatcher servlet, but 99% of the times we always call the dispatcher servlet. Clear, Ravi? Okay, that's good. Now, the next question to everyone. Once a URL pattern comes to dispatcher servlet like login, logout, register or whatever, will the dispatcher servlet know what exactly to do? Yes or no? Awesome, very good. The dispatcher servlet will never know what exactly to do with this incoming URL patterns unless you tell it. So next question to everyone. How do you tell the dispatcher servlet about what exactly it needs to do? Config file, very good. So let's keep it more interactive, team. So please try to answer the questions. You'll understand a lot here. Okay. Now I say the concept like dispatcher servlet does not know anything to do unless you tell it. So how do you tell the dispatcher servlet? You tell the dispatcher servlet by using again a config file. Now, can you write the config file with any name? The answer is no. Why? Because the dispatcher servlet looks for a specific name. Okay, the dispatcher servlet will look for a specific name. What is that name? We'll see that. See here. I say init param. This is how I invoke it, and I say param name and param value. Okay, param name and param value. What is the name that I need to use here is context config location. Okay, if you go back to struts, if you remember, I told that for giving this config file you need to give a specific name like config only. That is what I told, right? But in Spring you need to give a different name. The name is context config location. The context config location. Okay, context config location. Now the next thing is the param value, the most important thing. Param value is nothing but the file name that you are going to write. So what exactly dispatcher servlet will look for is, dispatcher servlet will look for a specific name which is servlet name hyphen servlet.xml. Okay, servlet name hyphen servlet.xml. So it's like, so what is servlet name? My servlet. So it will look for servlet name hyphen servlet.xml. This is the specific file it will look for. So let me write that under web-inf slash web hyphen inf slash my servlet hyphen servlet.xml. So is this naming configuration clear to everyone? Why I used that specific name? Okay, now I'm going to change something. So based on the changes, let me know what is the naming that I need to use at line number 19. Yeah, context is nothing but, see, context is something which contains all the information. So in general terms, what exactly I can say is context configuration. So in that specific context, in this context, what is the, say if suppose if a car is moving at 100 kilometers per hour, so when I say, hey, what is the speed of the car in that context? So what do you say? The speed is 100 kilometers. And what is the gear in which going? So you can say like it's going in sixth gear. And what is the throttle or thrust or whatever, some technical terms, if I ask some questions, you will try to answer them at that instance of time. What exactly are the values or the properties of that car at that instance of time, like 100 kilometers per hour and sixth gear, like blah blah blah, right? The same way, the context is something like all the values which the servlet can have at that instance of time. Okay. So basically all this context and all, like in a web application, what are the context values that you're setting and all depends on like if you're passing some initialization parameters or any other parameters. Okay. Now in this context, we will load all the configurations. Okay. Now I'm making some changes at some location. Let me know what will be the file name at line number 19 based on the changes that I'm going to do. What's the answer? Call the Spring servlet hyphen servlet.xml. Excellent. Okay, that's the answer. So now I say here, call the Spring servlet hyphen servlet.xml. I hope you understood the concept which I'm trying to say. So the concept which I said here is, every time dispatcher servlet needs to read a config file, it will look for a config file with with a specific pattern called servlet name hyphen servlet.xml. That is the file it will look for. Okay. I hope all the basic configurations that we did in web.xml is clear to everyone. Okay, now what I do here is, there is a project Spring MVC project. This is our project. Okay. So now what I will do here is, I will create this XML file which I wrote at line number 19 under WebINF. So for that, let me do one more thing. Let me go back, copy this spring beans.xml, okay, spring-beans.xml, and paste it here under WebINF and rename that file as called spring servlet-servlet.xml. Okay, deal done. Now, if I double click on this, so let me remove these configurations. Control Shift F. And everyone knows that this is a specific file where I need to go ahead and configure all my classes. Like if I have some multiple beans, I need to go back and configure all the beans in this specific file, right? Now, before I make some changes in this file, I will add or I will explain few more concepts, okay? But the basic concept here is, let us assume that you do have some configurations saying that you have a bean which you need to call, or if you want to do some URL mapping saying that if login comes, which class to call, how to validate. If you remember the struts, let me just compare it with struts once again. Control Shift struts hyphen config.xml. In struts config.xml, I hope everyone remembers the concept where we wrote all the form bean entries and we wrote the action mappings and action entries saying that when login comes, login action needs to be called. When register comes, register action needs to be called, and some messages. All these configurations are done in struts config.xml. The same old configurations will be done in this file, but in a much easier way. Okay, in a much easier way. And to put it this way, all these configurations will go into one single line in Spring. Okay, why? Because in Spring we will start looking into annotations. So all the highlighted part which you have defined inside this structs file is equivalent to one single line in Spring. Okay, we'll see those configurations slowly. Now, for that, what I will do here is, let me go ahead and create two files. Okay, two different files. One is a JSP file and the other is a Java file. So my aim is to make sure that once I enter some data in the JSP file like a login.jsp and hit submit button, I want to call the Java class. That is my first aim. Okay, so for that, the next scenario that you need to understand here is, in Spring, the way I create a JSP file is slightly different. Means I'm talking about the location. If you go back to a structs project, okay, if you go back to a structs project, all the JSP pages are created inside the web content folder and outside the webinf folder. But the default structure in Spring says that, hey, make sure that you can secure these pages and place them inside webinf folder so that people cannot access them directly with the help of URL. Okay, so that is one change that you need to understand. You can place it outside also, but let's stick to the basics. So what I will do is, inside webinf I will create a folder called some views or any name. The folder name can be anything. Model view controller, all the views will be written here. So inside this views I will go ahead and create some page called a JSP page. So I will say login.jsp. Okay, so notice here the JSP page that I'm going to create is under webinf and views. The only specific reason is to make them more secure. So now in this JSP page, as everyone knows that we will be going ahead and creating some specific forms, or the stuff is like, let me go ahead and copy some tag that I need. So under webinf, something called as a views login.jsp, I need this tag. Do you remember in structs also we used this tag where I say like, if I use that tag given by the structs framework, I can use some custom tags given by the structs framework. The same way, if I can use this tag inside my JSP page, I can use some custom tags defined by the Spring framework which can ease my work. Okay, I've added the tag library, and any tag, if I prefix it with form, then it means that it is a Spring tag. Okay, so now the first one, what is that we need here? We need the basic stuff like the username, password, two text boxes, and then a button to submit it. Okay, so these are the three things that I need. So the first one that I say is FO or form colon. So I'm not using the basic HTML tags. I'm using a tag which is given by the Spring framework. So form. One second. Sometimes some keys on my keyboard are not working properly. So this is a Spring given form. So in this, the first thing that I do here is I need to configure the action. I'll configure this action later. The next thing that I need to do here is the method. Method equal to, by default I will write it as post. Okay, so let me again compare the same old stuff with this structs project that we did. First structs project, even in structs also, I hope you remember, like I said action equal to blah blah something, method equal to post, and I wrote all this username, text box, password, submit button, all these fields. The same old concept goes here. So once I create a form, the next thing that I'm going to create is something like for username. So I say username colon. I need to give a text box. So I say form colon input. So in the input, what I do is like I say like this is an input text box, and the path that I write here is something called as username. Okay, username, then br for break line, password. The same old concept. This is a password. So if it is a password, you need to secure it. So what I say, form colon password, and in the path I say password. We are break line. Now the next thing is you need to submit. Okay, so all I do is like I just use something called as form column select column button, then I say the name or the value as the basic thing, log into app. Okay, these things are given. Now the most important thing that you need to understand here is if I send some request onto the server, and if the server sends back some error messages to me, how can I display those error messages? So the basic concept here is you can always use the regular tags which are defined by the JSP, like the scriptlet tags and all those tags, and you can check for all the incoming errors, and if there is an error you can always go ahead and display it, right? The same old logic which we did in our JSP project. Apart from that, there is a different way that we took in structs project. Do you remember here we are using structs given tags? Do you remember here we used something called as HTML errors, the property tag and username. This is what we have used. So why we have used this specific tag called HTML errors? Why? Because this tag is given by the struts framework, which will tell, hey, if there are any errors, it can automatically display those errors for this field. We need not again go back and check for all the errors. This simple tag will help us in doing all that. Okay, so what I do here is let me just copy this style, this div, means whatever div that I have copied here is just for displaying it in a red color. Okay, so this div red color. The next one is form colon errors. So this errors tag by default will read all the errors which are there in the username. Okay, and here no end tag for div. Okay, div end tag. The same old concept for password also. Okay, so our basic login page is complete, but the action we will see that maybe if you want to understand the basic action that I will write here is login. Okay, there is no specific format like login dot do or dot abc or anything can be written here. Why? Because we are accepting everything in this basic Spring project. Okay, this is our basic login page where we are using all the Spring given form tags. Okay, is this clear to everyone? I just want to ask two things. The first thing is we all considered some configurations in the web.xml, and in the web.xml we configured the dispatcher servlet which can read a configuration file. That is the first set of configurations. And the second one that we did in here is like we created a login page, and in the login page we are going ahead and clicking on submit button, which will send a request called login to the server. So the next aim is to check like, hey, if a login is being created or is being called, which Java class needs to be called? That is the next configuration that we need to see. Any doubts till this point? Any questions? everyone. Very good. Now see here. In the SRC, as we already know that we want to call a Java class, the first thing that I go ahead and do here is in the SRC, I will go ahead and create a specific Java file where in this Java file, the basic configurations that I will say here is like, hey, I will use a specific term called controller. I will explain you why I have used that specific term called controller. Okay. So for now, I say like new class and say here as form dot easy learn java dot controller, and I want to call a Java class from the JSP page. The Java class name is nothing but login controller. Okay. Just understand the standard naming convention that I'm using. If you correlate the same concept with Spring or with the struts, in struts I have created something called as login action class. So all those classes in struts are called as action classes. So in Spring they are all called as controller classes. Okay, and don't get confused that login controller is not a controller. The controller in Spring is the dispatcher servlet. Okay, MVC concept. Views are nothing but JSP pages. The controller is nothing but dispatcher servlet, and the login controller and all those things are Java classes which will be called by the controller. Okay, now I will explain some stuff here. Login controller, and here I will write one more thing called abc dot abc.java, and just for some testing purpose I'm writing some one more class bbc.java. Okay, so login controller abc bbc, this is what I have, and this web.xml I'm closing, struts config.xml, login.jsp, all the unnecessary stuff I have closed. Now one more important configuration that I need to make here, but why I'm making this configuration you might not understand at this point unless I go ahead and write it and explain it. So what I will do here is outside web content I will create something called as index.jsp. I will explain all this stuff in a minute. A JSP file index.jsp. So now if you remember in the web.xml, did you notice here the welcome file that I have configured is nothing but the index.jsp. So the index.jsp is the one which will be called initially, okay, when I load the project. In index.jsp there is only one line of code that I will be writing, okay, so that is nothing but a forward tag JSP colon forward. Where do you want me to forward? The page is nothing but any meaningful name. Forward to login page is what I have written. Okay. I'll explain this what I have written and all. Control Shift and format this one index.jsp. Now the next thing that I'm going to write here is okay. See here. As soon as I click on submit button, where will the request come? The request comes to the web.xml, it goes to dispatcher servlet, it reads the config and all. Okay, that's fine. But ultimately, where will this request needs to be sent? The request coming from the login.jsp needs to be sent to a class called login controller.java. That is the class to which you need to send. Now, just going back to the concept of struts. In struts, if you remember, there is a concept where I wrote that a tag called action mapping tags, right? We wrote some action mapping tags. In that, we wrote some action tags. In that action, if I say login, go to login action. If it is register, it goes to register action. So we are configuring there which URL needs to go to which pattern. That is what we are writing, right? So in Spring also we need to configure saying that if a pattern comes called login, send to login controller. That is what we need to write. So for that, see what is the configuration that I am trying to write here. The first configuration that I need to write here is, and before I write this, the most important thing is Spring, whatever we are using is all annotation based. When I say annotation based, the amount of code that we are going to write will reduce a lot. Okay. So the first step that I'm going to write in the dispatcher servlet is MVC annotation driven. Okay. It means that, hey, in this MVC concept, I am using some annotations. That is the meaning of line number 15. Okay. There is the first line that I'm writing, annotation driven, which means I'm telling the dispatcher servlet saying that I'm using annotations in my project. And then at line number 17, I'm going to make some configuration saying that context component scan. Okay. Context component scan, and I say base package equal to com dot java dot control. Okay. So this is the most important configuration where I am saying that, hey, base package is this, which means what happens in this scenario is a dispatcher servlet, when it reads this line number 17, it understands that it needs to go ahead and scan some components which are present in this package. Okay, it needs to go ahead and scan for some classes which are present in that package. So now what I will do is, on top of login controller, let me use an annotation called @controller, control space, no, control shift R, no, sorry, control shift O, import that. See, the controller annotation that I'm using at line number 5 is already defined by the Spring framework itself. Now let me explain the concept here. The first concept, starting from the scratch, when a valid URL pattern comes, this servlet is invoked, which means the dispatcher servlet is invoked, and the dispatcher servlet reads this config file. As soon as the dispatcher servlet reads the config file, the first thing it understands that, okay, it is annotation driven program. That's fine. Next, it says like the context component scan. The dispatcher servlet understands that it needs to read the classes present in that package. So first it will check for that package. Okay, it has this package. Now let us assume that there is one more package called a.b.c. Okay, now this package a.b.c will not be scanned by the dispatcher servlet. Why it will not be scanned? Why? Because I only told to read com.easylearnjava.controller. That is the reason why any other packages in my current project will not be scanned. Okay, so a.b.c is out of scope. It only scans com.easylearnjava.controller. So now when I say The dispatcher servlet is scanning that package. It means the dispatcher servlet will go to that package and read all the classes, and it will look for some specific type of annotations. So what are those specific type of annotations? See here, if I just hover my mouse on this, see here it shows scans the class path for annotated components that will be auto registered by as a Spring Beans. By default, the Spring provider like @component, @repository, @service, @controller, which means these are all the annotations. If you write in your program, the dispatcher servlet reads it and understands them as Spring Beans. Okay, very simple concept. Let's go back to yesterday's program. In yesterday's program, every object that the Spring container, if it wants to create, what is the first step that we did? We created a beans.xml file, and in that beans.xml file we gave all the bean entries. If we can give the bean entries, the Spring container can create that objects for us, right? If I don't give an entry in spring beans.xml, the Spring container will never ever know about them, right? The same way, in the annotation driven programming, all you need to do is you must annotate your class with any of these annotations. So if you can annotate them with these kind of annotations, then the dispatcher servlet will register them as Spring Beans. If they are registered as Spring Beans, the Spring container can maintain their life cycle, which means the Spring container can create those objects for you. Okay. Now, what I said, since I said the base package is com.easylearnjava.controller, the controller will go ahead and means the dispatcher servlet will go ahead and read all the classes in this controller class, in this controller package. Now, my question to everyone, notice very carefully the three classes that I am showing you. Login controller is one class that that we see here with annotation at line number 5. The other one is abc.java and the other one is bbc.java. Now my question is, out of these three classes, how many classes will be registered as Spring Beans by the dispatcher servlet? Okay, people are saying one. Can you tell me the name of that class? Okay, Ravi, it's not none, it's one, which is nothing but the login controller. Very good. Now, the next question to everyone. Why login controller will be registered as a Spring Bean by the dispatcher servlet? What is the reason? Excellent answer. Because it has an annotation called @controller at line number 5. Okay. So now, what are the different types of annotations that a class can have? @controller or @component or @repository or @service. Okay, it can have n number all these any of these annotations. But if you understand, each annotation that we use here has means ideally they are not much different. They are almost the same. But the major difference that you need to understand here is any class that is annotated with @controller is the only class that the dispatcher servlet can call when a URL pattern comes. Okay. Now, before I reiterate the same statement, one quick question to everyone. Okay. Let's go back to the concept of structs. In structs there are different classes we saw. See here, I just want to ask one question, so I'm just going back to the structs project. In the structs project, if you see, I do have multiple packages. One is a DAO package, DTO, or some forms, some property files, service, util, and in the web again some classes, action classes. Now my question here is, when a valid URL pattern comes, out of all these classes, what are the classes that the action servlet can call? The one we defined in the action mapping, that's correct. But again, the most important thing that everyone needs to understand here is, if our class is extending action, then only the action servlet can call these classes. If not, even if you make an entry in the structs config.xml, this class can never be called, which means like, see, understand a scenario like this. Let us assume that this is how you have defined, saying that public class login action, and you were in structs-config.xml, in structs-config.xml you say when login comes, go ahead and call login action. This is what you have configured. If I give that login action there, it will never call unless the login action class extends the action. Okay, so answer my question once again. Out of all the classes which you see in the struts project, what are all the classes which are eligible by the struts action servlet to be called? What is the criteria it must have? Very good. The answer is any class which extends action is only eligible to be called by the action servlet in struts, right? Now I'm reiterating the same concept to in Spring. In Spring, okay, if you go back to the Spring, any class which is annotated with @controller is the one which is eligible to be called by the dispatcher servlet when a URL pattern comes. Is that clear to everyone? Okay. Now there are three classes in my current package: login controller, ABC, and BBC. Now out of these three classes, which class is eligible, or which class my dispatcher servlet can call? Excellent. Only login controller can be called. Why? Because that is the one which is annotated with @controller. Okay. Now the next question I am saying here is register controller. So now answer quickly. How many classes in this package can a dispatcher servlet call? What is the number? Very good. Excellent. 2. Now the next step that we will understand here is, how can the dispatcher servlet know that, hey, if login comes, go to login controller. If register comes, means as per our understanding, the specific naming standards that we are using is like, if a request from login page comes, take to login controller. If a request from register page comes, take to register controller. Like that, we are using some specific naming conventions, right? So now my question is, if a request from login page comes, how will the dispatcher servlet know that it needs to call the login controller only? Okay, that's the first question. Now, before we answer that question, again going back to the concept of struts. In struts, where did we write those configurations? Very good. In config file. Okay. One second. So this is the config file where we write those configurations for struts. Now let me close this struts file and come to the Spring. In Spring, what I do here is I will not write those configurations in the XML file. Rather, I will write in the Java class itself the most important configuration that I am doing here is in the login controller. Why? Because in the login controller, since I am annotating with @controller, there is one more annotation that I can go ahead and use, which can explain me or which can tell me like, hey, which URL pattern that you are expecting. That is what it can say. So what I can do here is I can use one more annotation called, see, it is very meaningful, @request mapping. Control Shift O, request mapping. And here at line number 7, I say that the request mapping that I do here is loading the value equal to slash login. Okay. So when a URL pattern called login comes, call this login controller. Okay. And I go to registration controller, and in register controller, again I will write one more configuration saying that @request mapping. Again, the request mapping is given by the Spring framework, and say here the value equal to, I say slash register. I hope by this time it must be clear to everyone, saying that @controller means this class is eligible to be called by the dispatcher servlet, and if a URL pattern called login comes, then only call this controller. If a URL pattern called register comes, then only call this controller. That is the concept. Clear till this point? So the first thing that we are understanding here is how a JSP page, when it sends a specific request, how I can hook it up to a controller. So once the request comes to the controller, from here onwards it's the same old thing, like get the details from the request, and or request or somewhere get the data, and once you get the data, all you need to do is like data validation, then go to the service layer, then go to the DAO layer, talk to the database, get the password, do the business logic comparison in the service layer, and send back a true or false to this method. So all that logic is the same old piece, which is like a simple one. But how this architecture works from the JSP page to the controller is what matters actually. Okay, now see here. The next question again to everyone. Going back to the struts program. In the struts program, what is the default method that will be called every time when a request comes to loginaction.java? Very good. The answer is do get. It is wrong. In struts, I'm asking. In struts, execute method. Very good. Execute is the method which will be called by default every time in a struts project, right? Now, in Spring, what you can do is it has a lot of flexibility where you can call any method. You can call you can write n number of methods, and you can call any type of method. So the first thing that I will write here is a very basic method. Okay, not in register controller. I will just close this register controller. I just wrote this register controller for your understanding purpose, saying that if login comes, login controller it will call. If register comes, register control it will call. So to explain that, I just wrote register controller. So now let's come back to the login controller. Yeah, index.jsp. Yeah, let me show index.jsp. This is index.jsp. Forward to login page. Okay. So now let me go back to the controller, and the next thing here, what we do is I will go ahead and make some specific configurations here. Okay. I'll go ahead and write some specific configurations where I can explain these configurations once I'm done with this. Okay. Maybe, or else I can copy, or maybe I can just go ahead and code this saying that public. What I am trying to do here is I'm trying to configure a method which will be called when a request called forward to login page is called. So let me take that question. Sai says. So Sai is saying that, so is there any meaning for that forward to? How are we using that term? Okay. Yeah, that's what I told. Like right now, it might not make any sense. Uh, Let me go ahead. Yeah, let me go ahead and write that logic, some simple logic. Once I run it, then I will be able to explain the concept, like why we are using a specific index.jsp page in this context. Okay, so what I say here is like public. Yeah, so I'm writing a specific method, mm, string. So if you notice, uh, method execute method in structs, the execute method will be returning back something like an action mapping object, but in Spring, whatever method you want to call, it can return back multiple things. Okay, it can return back a lot of things. It has a probability that it can return back a string, it cannot return anything, or it can return a model view object. There are a lot of scenarios that it can return back. So let's start with a basic concept. So I'm returning back a string, that is what I say, public string, and I'm writing a method name called bind form, which makes with a meaningful name. So bind form, and in this bind form, the object that I'm passing to this bind form is model. Okay, see, model is nothing but org spring framework UI dot model. So the model, you can consider that as in MVC. We saw what is a view. View is nothing but a JSP page, and the controller, excuse me, the controller is nothing but the log dispatcher servlet. Sorry, the controller in Spring is the dispatcher servlet, and then what is left is model. What is the use of a model? Model can help us in taking the data from the UI to the Java class, and from the Java class back to the UI. It can do that stuff. Okay, now what I do here is, in this model, basically in this model, I can transfer or transmit the data to and forth. And the next thing that you can understand here is the flexibility in defining the methods here. Did you notice here I wrote some random method with some random name, and to that I am passing the variable that I want, that is nothing but a model class. So Spring gave us this flexibility of defining the parameters that you can pass to methods also. Okay, so now the next concept. In this bind form, I will write some logic for now. You might not be able to understand clearly. So let me make a change at line number 8. Make some changes. Control X, and write here at the rate request mapping value equal to login, and okay, not login, I say this, this is for index.jp forward to login page. We'll explain this step by step. Just give me a minute. And the next one I say is like method equal to request method dot get. So the meaning of line number 11 is, hey, when a URL pattern called forward to login page comes, and if it is a get request, call this method. That is the meaning. We'll explain it once again. So I say model dot add attribute model object form new login form. Okay, so this is the form that I will go ahead and define as my model. Okay, so what I do here is, so Tim, just not to worry, like I understand that the concept that I'm writing here is all new. I will explain in a while. Form dot easy java dot form login form. Okay, let me just complete this controller, and in this controller I say return a string that I'm returning back as login. Okay, excuse me. So the only thing that is unknown here is like the login controller. So in the sorry, the login form. So in the login form, what I do here is, like, I can go ahead and define a form class called login form, which contains the username and password. Okay, so in the login form I define again saying that private string, okay, sorry, private string username, generate getters and setters, okay, login controller dot java. I come back and say control shift O. Okay, see here the form class is loaded. So let me just make sure that go back and change this as model. This is a model object that we call here. So instead of form I say it as model. Nothing's wrong in saying a form also, but let me make it as a model. So this is the model class that I'm using like a login form. Now I wrote a basic configuration. Let's not worry about what I have written at line number 15 to line number 16. That's the secondary part. But the only thing that I want you to understand at this point is, whenever a request called forward to login page comes, and if it is of type get request, then this method will be called and it will return back login. That is the only concept that I want you to understand. Is that clear? I will explain 15 and 16 again later. Okay, that's good. So when a request comes, this is the method that is being called, and login. This is the string that is being returned back to the dispatcher servlet. So what exactly the dispatcher servlet does is, this is again one important configuration. Maybe let me go back and copy that configuration, specific configuration. So whatever I have configured is again a predefined bean. So the predefined bean name is internal resource view resolver. Okay. So what exactly this internal resource view resolver bean does is, whenever a method that it has called, okay, what is that the dispatcher servlet has called? The dispatcher servlet has called the login controller. So what is the return that is coming from the login controller? Login is what is coming back. right? Now the dispatcher servlet will search for a page using the internal resource view resolver. What is the page it will look for is, see here. So I'm getting back something called as login from the login controller. If you see at line number 20, there is a term called prefix. And what is the value for the prefix? Slash webinf slash views, which means this is the path that will be built automatically on the fly at runtime. See here, slash web hyphen inf slash views slash, okay, that is the prefix, and to that prefix it will add the return type from the login controller. What is that which is being returned? Login. That will be, okay, this is what is being returned from the login controller. Okay, that is what is highlighted at login is added. And then if you see at line number 23, the suffix is nothing but the value is .jsp. So login dot JSP, right? So this is the path that will be built on the fly by the help of internal resource view resolver. What it will do is it will search for this path webinf slash views. It will say, is webinf there? Yes. Is views there? Yes. In that, is login.jsp there? Yes. Then go ahead and display that page back to the user. Okay, so because of this path, okay, it will look for this path and build that path and display that page back to the user. Okay, I'll re-explain the concept once again. So let me go ahead and do some simple steps here. Let me put a debug, place a debug point in the controller at line number 15. Okay, and debug the server and see if the request is coming here or not. Once it comes, we can understand a lot of scenarios. Okay, so I say, by default, the other thing that I want you to understand here is whenever the server starts, by default, the page that will be called is index.jsp. And in index.jsp, if you go there, I'm just writing a JSP forward tag, which means anytime someone calls this JSP page, index.jsp, what it will do is it will straight away send a forward like this URL pattern to the server. So this URL pattern will come to the server. Once this URL pattern comes to the server, since that is a valid URL pattern, the dispatcher servlet will be invoked. The dispatcher servlet reads this XML file and understands that, okay, since it is annotation driven, it reads the controller. So in the controller, it reads all the 4 files and it understands that only 2 files are eligible to be called when a URL pattern comes. So what is the URL pattern that is coming? The URL pattern that is coming is forward to login page. Now it goes to a file called register controller and checks, is this class eligible to be called when forward to action comes? No, this is not eligible because this class is expecting only register. Then it means it can go to any controller. So it goes to this controller again and checks, hey, is this controller eligible to be called by the dispatcher servlet? The answer is yes. Why? Because it has a request mapping tag at line number 13 which exactly matches to this incoming URL pattern. So that is the reason why this method is called, which is present in this controller. That is the concept. So let me go ahead, debug and explain this concept. So let me just project. The Spring MVC project. So right click, debug as, debug on server, say finish. Now the very basic concept Once again, I'm trying to explain here. How did this controller is called? Anyone wants to volunteer and explain this? Because can you explain me the concept, like how the control came to line number 15? It's okay, like even if you miss out, I can try to help you out. Anyone? Okay, yeah, because please go ahead.
Yeah, first of all,
Can you
it will
be a
come to the
little bit
login.
louder with us? Just a little bit.
First of all, it will come to the login controller class.
No, no, no. Okay,
Uh,
okay. The first scenario always you need to understand here is when we run the project, what is the URL pattern that will be sent? The URL pattern that would be sent will be localhost colon 8080 slash the context root. What is the context root? Spring MVC project. This is the URL pattern that will be sent onto the server. So as soon as the URL pattern comes, it comes to web.xml. So what happens from there? Because
yeah, when it comes to the web.xml, it will it will see the dispatcher servlet, and from
okay,
there it will map
I
to the
I have highlighted something for you as a hint.
yeah. Whatever the file is mentioned in the welcome file list, that will be that will map to that file, and after that file is opened, as we have the can you open the index.js? As we have here that forward to login page,
Mhm.
that attribute here, the forward attribute, that will check for that URL pattern. I mean, not here. I don't know what do we call in that. Can you go to login controller?
Okay, no. So see here again, stick to the basics. Whenever this index.jsp is called, the index.jsp sends a request or sends a forward called forward to login page. So what is the URL pattern that is coming to the application? Because
Forward to login page.
exactly, this is the URL pattern that comes to our application. Now, it goes to again web.xml. So, is that a valid URL pattern? Yes or no?
Yes,
Okay. So, if it is a valid URL pattern, who needs to handle that URL?
dispatcher servlet.
Exactly. The dispatcher servlet needs to take control from there, and the dispatcher servlet needs to decide what exactly to do with that URL pattern. My next question. Will the dispatcher servlet know on its own what to do?
No.
Okay, then what will happen?
Yeah, it will. Can you open that? Yeah, call the
So,
spring servlet dot
yeah,
xml.
all you need to say is since the dispatcher servlet will not know what to do, it will call or it will read the XML file that we told to read, which is nothing but call the spring servlet hyphen servlet.xml. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Next steps. What is the next step?
Yeah, next step is
The next step is the dispatcher servlet needs to understand, hey, there is a URL coming. Which controller class I need to call? So it first does a component scan and it goes to this controller package and it will read all the classes and it will understand that only A class called login controller is eligible to be called in this context. Why? Because that is the only class which has that specific URL pattern, and that is also annotated with @controller. Okay, so that is the reason why this method is called. So clear, Vikas, and to everyone else.
Yes.
Okay, so it returns back a login, and as I already told, based on this prefix and suffix, this JSP page will be displayed back to the user. Okay, there is some exception. What is this exception? Oh, okay. Command available. Okay. The most important thing that we need to configure again back in a JSP page. So if you see the exception, it shows that neither command or all these things is available, right? So the first thing that we need to configure in a JSP page is there is an additional parameter that we need to configure. Okay. The parameter here is login.jsp. I say the parameter name is command name. The command name that I need to use here is, I go back to login controller. In the login controller, I say model object form. So the model object form is the command name that I give here. Okay, so let me go ahead and one last time run it once again. Finish. Yeah, go ahead, Sai.
Yes, from the method in login control class, we are trying a string called login, right?
One second, sorry. Yeah, can you please ask again once again?
Yeah, in login controller class, yeah, we are trying to return some string called login here, right? At line
Uh-huh.
number 16.
Mm-hmm.
So this login should that match the name of the JSP file or the one we have in action that one?
Very good. It must match the JSP file name. Why? Because do you
Yeah,
remember like I was
as it is
explaining?
following up.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
like,
as it is the path it should match.
yeah, you can go ahead, Sai.
Yeah, yeah, got it. Yeah, now I got it. As it is taking prefix and suffix, that should definitely match the file name.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay, okay, got it.
Very good. Now see here. Forward button is not working. I'll check that one second. So form button. Let me say input type equal to submit. Hmm. Okay. So So here I wrote a simple name called command name, and for that command name I gave the value as model object form. So what is that model object form? The model object form is nothing but the one that I wrote at line number 15, which is nothing but new login form. Okay, so my JSP page is displayed. Okay, JSP page is displayed. Now if you understand the concept once again, what I'm trying to do at this context is, by the time a JSP page is displayed, I want to bind a model object to the JSP page. Okay, I want to bind a model object back to the JSP page, so that anytime I enter some data here like Raghu or Naveen or whatever, that will be bound to the model object. How will I know that which model object that it needs to bind? See here, I'm writing a command name called model object form, which I have exactly written as the model object dot add attribute key value pair model object form. So the exact name that I gave in the JSP, which means it will create a new login form. So in the login form, you have username and password. So as soon as you enter some username and password here, they will be bound to this username and password for you. Okay, now uh, means even though I have explained it a couple of times, again I'm asking the same old question. Any doubts? Why? Because the most important concept, if you don't understand, it will be going to be literally very difficult for you. uh, I did not get any response from others, so at least I understand that it is a yes from you, like there are no doubts, so I can proceed. So I'm going ahead and I'm going to the next step. So now the first and the foremost thing that I have achieved here is I'm able to display a JSP page, and to that JSP page I have bound a model object. Now one step back into the structs application. In the structs-config.xml, understand here, when this login comes, this is the action class that you need to call. And if you remember the name that I'm writing here, my own login form must exactly match with the line number 11, and it will call this login form. I hope you remember this, which means when a request from the login page comes, all the data in the login request will be bound to the properties inside the login form. So using a tag called name at line number 20, I am binding a form to this request, right? So that the data in the request can be attached to this form. That is what I did in structs application. The same thing I'm doing in Spring in a different way. So for the first time, I'm saying that, hey, I create a model object and say mod key value pair. The key is model obj form, and I'm saying new login form. I'm creating a new form, and where exactly I'm using the key? I'm using the key in a page called login.jsp as the command name, which means into this JSP page, I am binding this login form so that the data entered in the username and password field can be associated to this username and password properties in this login form. Okay, I hope that is clear to everyone. Now the next step. So the next step that I do here is, let us assume that in this login.jsp, I go ahead and click submit. Okay. Once I click submit, the request must come to the login controller. Okay. Now what is the URL? Everyone, look at this page and tell me what is the URL pattern that I am sending from this login.jsp. Very good. The URL pattern that I am sending from this page is login. Why? Because at line number 12, I wrote a specific configuration called action, and in action, I am writing some specific URL pattern called login. So that is the request that will be sent. Now, the next question. When I say login, am I sending a get request or a post request? Very good. It is the post that I am sending. See here, what is that I am going to write? I am going to call a method like public string process form. Okay. So when will this method call? Will be called request mapping, and in that request mapping, what is the value? The value that will come is login. Okay, comma, and the method that I am going to call is, see, anytime when a login URL pattern comes, and if it is a post request, then only go ahead and call this method. That is what I'm writing. And in this method, I will add my own parameters. See here, parameters which I'm flexible with. I'm saying at the rate valid, control shift O, import that. Okay, at the rate valid. Okay, it's not. Okay, let's just wait and see. 1 second. Then and the rate model attribute, and the model attribute is exactly the attribute that is coming from the JSP page. This is the attribute, and what is the form? Login form, comma, binding result, and the model object. Control shift O. Okay, yeah, it has imported the valid also at line number 3. Okay, good. Now I will say that everything is successful. Okay, let us assume that it's a happy path, and we will return to login success. Okay, so let me create a page called login success. Some message I wrote, and the next one that I want to say here is I just want to output the username and password. So the username and password that I can get is like this out. Username that I have entered is form.getUsername. Get password. Okay, I just want to print the username and password. Now let me make some more changes to the login form. So in the login form, all I do is like do some basic validations using all those. See, do you remember in, if I say login form in structs project, do you remember I wrote a validate method and wrote all the basic configurations and all the stuff? The same thing I'm using or I'm doing in structs, sorry, in Spring, using annotations at the rate not empty, at the rate size, and here I can say minimum equal to 5 characters and max equal to 15 characters. The same way, size minimum equal to, okay. We'll explain slowly one by one. Now the next step, let me place a debug point at line number 26. Go ahead, debug the application once again. Okay, it initially it came here. Okay, now if I go to this page, okay, a JSP page is displayed, so I say Raghu and the password is, I say secret, and I say this one and hit enter. Did you notice here the request came back to this method called process form, and the username that it prints is Raghu, and the password it prints is secret, and it goes to the success page. Welcome to Spring MVC application. Is it clear like how a request from a JSP page is coming to the controller and controller is processing something and it is able to go to the success page? Now let me explain the basic scenarios that I wrote at line number 24. At line number 24, there are some basic fundamental concepts that I have written. So the first one is I wrote something called as at the rate valid. Okay. So when I say at the rate valid, what happens is I am telling the data, means that is coming from the user. I want to validate the data. So I just write an annotation called at the rate valid. So when I say at the rate valid, the data will be validated. Which data will be validated? The data which is coming in the model object form. Do you remember here in the JSP, the command name that I wrote is model object form. Okay, so the data which is coming in this model object form will be bound to this form object, which is nothing but of type login form, which means whatever form that you are binding to the JSP page and whatever form that brings the data from the user, it is nothing but the login form. So we are telling the Spring to validate the login form. Third, we are telling it to validate the data present in the login form. So what I do here is I go to login form and it will, okay, not this one, this is for structs. So I go to the login form and it will check for basic things. Is it empty or is the size less than 5 and all these things. If anything fails, okay, it will do something else. I will explain that later. But in the happy path, everything is good. So it goes to this success page. Now, let me explain a negative scenario. So when I say negative scenario, let me explain that if the validation fails, okay, which means instead of 5 characters, I entered only 2 characters and I entered 5 characters here. I say log into my app And if you notice here, the validations have happened in the background. Why? Because I told at the rate valid and it has validated the data. Now in this context, if you notice, there are errors. Why? Because the username must be 5 characters. I'm passing only 2 characters. So if you see the result object, notice here, if you see the result object, it shows there is one error. And if you notice the error, it shows field error in object model form for the field username. Okay, so what is it saying? Rejected value RA. It has rejected this value RA. Why? Because the username validation has failed. What is the failed validation? It says that, hey, the validation for size has failed. Why? Why? Because the size is expecting 5 characters, but here it is, you are sending only 2 characters. Okay, so since you are sending only 2 characters, the validation has failed. That is what it says. Now the next concept, if the validation has failed, you must never ever proceed further. You need to go back and display the error messages, right? But in this context, I'm not doing that scenario. Like I'm always going to the success page. I'm not going back to the login page, or no, I'm not displaying the error messages. So what I do here is in the login controller, okay, I will write some logic here saying that if the object result, which is of type binding result, if this result dot has errors, okay, if it has errors, then the object value will be false. Okay, sorry, it will be true, which means saying that hey, it has some errors. Now what is the next concept that you need to do? If it has errors, just say return the user back to the login page. Okay, if not, go to success page. If there are any errors, then go to login page. Now see here, I hope, yeah, the context has reloaded. Now see here, I say RA and I say SECRET, secret, and let me put a debug point at line number 26. I say submit. Now see here, the validations happened and there must be an error. Why? Because I'm only passing 2 characters. So again username says rejected value RA. Now if you see result dot has errors, Control Shift I, inspect. Yes, it is true. It has errors. Since it has errors, take the user back to the login page. So now if I say F6, it returns login. Then the same old concept, the prefix and suffix. Once then error is returned based on the internal resource view resolver, it calls the log webinf views slash login dot JSP. This is how a page is built, and the request will be sent back to the login page. And in the login page, if you remember, I have already configured some form errors tag. Based on this form errors tag, it automatically detects, hey, if there is an error for username, then it will display that for you. Okay, so let me go ahead and insert something like I say SE, just 2 characters. If I say that, see, size must be between 5 and 15, again it shows. If I enter again, it says, hey, size must be between 5 and 15 and it may not be empty. So these are all the error messages which the Spring app is defining for you. Okay, so all these messages are being displayed because you have already written a, or you have already used a Spring given form error tag. Okay, form errors tag. So if there are any errors for password, they will be displayed for this password. If there are any errors for username, they will be displayed using this form errors for username again. Okay, so if there are no errors, then it will go ahead and display, means you can do a lot of stuff from here, all the service layer and all. But here the next part begins in this, like auto wiring, injecting and all. That is the second part of this application. But the first part is how you come to the controller and go back from the controller to a JSP page or a success page. That's the first part of Spring MVC. Any doubts or any questions till this point? Line number 17, that is by default get. Okay, yeah, that's correct. In line number 17, by default the request is get, and the other thing is if you don't write this one also it will work. Why? Because by default a request mapping, if you don't write, it will look for a get method itself directly. Okay, so even if I keep the line number 17 as is, which is shown right now, or if I do this, both are same, both are expecting a get request. Okay, clear to everyone? So can the login.jsp page say the method? One second, let me take that question. So the login.jsp uh, say the method as get. Okay, login.jsp is using a post method. Notice here, I'm saying the method as post. I can always say it is as get. So if I change this as get, then the process form can never be called. So to call that method again, I need to change this post to get. Then only the process form can be called. But ideally, when you're sending some sensitive data from a JSP page, you will never make it as get. You make it as post. Is it clear?
Yeah, yeah. I understand why we put post there, but when we write get, will there be any case like ambiguity? There are two methods get here. How the request mapping chooses whether the bind form or a process form?
What is that I have highlighted?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, got it.
Okay. Now, to answer your
Yes, yes,
question,
understand.
okay, to answer your question, for everyone, like I'm just saying that Sai has asked a question like, hey, if the login.jsp also sends a get request, which method will be called? Basically, all you need to understand is the URL pattern. Is the login.jsp sending this URL pattern? No, it is not sending this URL pattern. It is sending a URL pattern called login, and it is sending something called as a post. So only process form can be called. There can be a scenario, where I wrote this method as a temp some, and in this temp this is ambiguity, but if I say this as get, see here, if the login page sends the request as a login, there are two candidates that are eligible to be called, either the process form or the temp method. But which method will be called? Since login.jsp is sending a post request, only this method will be called. But rather, if the login.jsp is sending a get request, the method at line number 24 will not be called. The temp method will be called. Why? Because the request is dot get here. Okay, is that clear, Sai, and to everyone else?
Yes, it is clear, but how a single login page can use both the post and get methods?
Okay, that's a very good question. So what I am trying to explain is single login page cannot send that, but let us assume that in future someone wants to say that, hey, I want to change it to get. So can my login controller handle get request also now? As simple as that. Okay. If not, let us assume that someone else from some other page, abc.jsp. From abc.jsp, they are sending a login request with a get method. Means ideally that should never be encouraged in a real world, but this is just a simple example that I'm explaining you. If that is the scenario that they are doing, can my controller handle it? Yes, my controller can handle it. Why? Because it can handle either the get or post for the login controller. for that login URL pattern. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, I'm just stopping the recording.